The history of Byzantium does not begin with a single act of foundation, but from within an already existing world, the Roman Empire on the verge of change. It is not a birth in one day, but a slow, profound transition, where one whole gradually transforms into another. Byzantium does not begin with a loud manifesto or a victorious conquest. It emerges as a result of a reinterpretation of power, faith, and culture. The crisis of the 3rd century AD deeply shakes Rome. The empire faces a series of usurpations, economic decline, barbarian invasions, and epidemics. This period is called the crisis of the 3rd century, and its result is the loss of previous stability. Within 50 years, more than 20 emperors succeed each other, and the state's borders weaken. Barbarian tribes cross the Rhine and Danube, Persia advances from the east, and internal trade collapses. Against this backdrop, the appearance of a reformer, Emperor Diocletian, who came to power in the year 284, is particularly important. He was not an aristocrat, but a soldier, a man from the provinces, and his approach to power was purely pragmatic. He divides power, introducing the system of tetrarchy. 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars govern different parts of the empire. The East receives a new centralized administrator and soon becomes more stable and richer than the West. However, after Diocletian's abdication in the year 315, the system collapses. The struggle for power flares up with renewed force. Against this backdrop of instability, Constantine, a charismatic military leader, son of Caesar Constantius Chlorus, emerges. His victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge in the year 312 becomes not only a military, but also a religious turning point. According to legend, Constantine saw a luminous cross in the sky, and the inscription, "In hoc signo vinces," "By this sign you shall conquer." He orders his soldiers to depict the Christian symbol on their shields, and he wins. In the following year, 313, the Edict of Milan is issued, granting Christians the right to freely practice their faith. Christianity, from a persecuted religion, transforms into the foundation of the future imperial worldview. Constantine not only patronizes Christians, but also bets on their unifying potential. The culmination of his policy is the founding of a new capital. In the year 330, he transfers the center of the empire to the ancient Greek city of Byzantium, located on the shores of the Bosphorus. The city is rebuilt, receives a new name, Constantinople, the new Rome. Its streets, forums, and palaces are created in the image of Rome, but with a new Christian spirit. This is the beginning of what would later be called Byzantium, an empire that for over 1,000 years would combine Roman heritage, Greek culture, and Christian faith. This is not just a geographical or political turning point. This is the beginning of a new civilization, in which power becomes sacred, the word connects with the image, and history becomes a path of spiritual formation. From the moment Christianity was adopted by Constantine, the most important process began. The formation of a new spiritual structure for the empire. Previously, Rome stood on a multiplicity of gods, rituals, and traditions of the ancient world. Now it was to become a Christian power, where faith would be the basis of unity. This transition was not easy, and one of the first milestones on this path was the First Ecumenical Council. In the year 325, at the initiative of Emperor Constantine, an assembly of bishops from all over the empire gathered in the city of Nicaea. This council, which went down in history as the Council of Nicaea, was the first large-scale gathering of the Christian Church, where a decisive step was taken towards formulating a unified faith. The main theological issue was the dispute about the nature of Jesus Christ. The priest Arius of Alexandria argued that the Son of God was not eternal and was created by the Father, meaning he was inferior in essence. This statement caused a stormy reaction. such authoritative figures as Alexander of Alexandria and Athanasius the Great spoke against Arius. The dispute was not only about words, it touched the very essence of the Christian understanding of God. More than 300 bishops gathered at the council. The sessions were tense. The emperor personally attended and insisted on agreement, believing that the unity of faith was the key to peace in the state. The result of the council was the condemnation of Arianism and the adoption of the Nicene Creed, which affirmed that the Son is consubstantial with the Father, meaning he is not created but begotten, eternal, and equal to him in divinity. This decision became the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. The Creed has been recited at every liturgy since then, but the significance of the Council of Nicaea went beyond theology. For the first time, the emperor became not just a defender of the Church, but its active participant. For the first time, faith was proclaimed a matter of state importance. Even then, a special Byzantine model began to take shape, a symphony of power and church. The emperor was not a priest, as in pagan Rome, but he began to be perceived as an episcopus of external affairs, one who guards the purity of faith, ensures its spread, and supports the hierarchy. Both the church and the state were responsible to each other and to God. However, the path to this unity was long and difficult. In the coming decades, Arianism would again raise its head, and disputes about the nature of Christ would lead to new councils and divisions. But it was in Nicaea that the principle was laid that would become the basis of Byzantine civilization. Truth is not a private matter, but the basis of the entire world order. The Creed, read under the arches of the Nicene Hall, became not only a theological document, it became an oath uniting East and West, a proclamation of a new era in which word, reason, and revelation intertwine to form the basis of an empire living in the Spirit. When Emperor Constantine moved the capital to ancient Byzantium, he did not simply choose a convenient place for governance. He created a new symbol of the world. The city, known in antiquity as Byzantium, received a new name, Constantinople, meaning the city of Constantine. But behind this name lay much more than honor to one ruler. It was the new Rome, the new capital of the world, where the Christian faith became the support of power, and the ancient heritage acquired a different, transformed meaning. The choice of location was deeply thought out. Constantinople was located at the crossroads of paths, between Europe and Asia, between North and South. On one side, it was protected by the waters of the Golden Horn and the Bosphorus. On the other, by fortress walls. Here it was easy to control trade, the army, and the navy. The city turned out to be impregnable and convenient at the same time. But most importantly, it was free from a pagan past, unlike Rome, whose streets were filled with temples of old gods. According to tradition, Constantine himself marked the boundaries of the new capital, walking on foot through the hills and ordering his companions to follow him. When asked if the city was too large, he replied, "I am following the one who goes before me." Thus, he indicated that he was building not by his own will, but by inspiration from above. Construction proceeded rapidly. Walls were erected, forums, a hippodrome, and an imperial palace were built. The best examples of ancient sculpture and architecture from across the empire were brought here. But along with this, something new also began. Christian churches were built, and in the center of the city rose the Church of Hagia Sophia, the first one, not yet the one we know as Justinian's masterpiece, but also majestic and bright. Representatives of noble Roman families, officials, military personnel, scholars, and bishops moved to Constantinople. The city immediately acquired the significance of a cultural and spiritual center. A senate, similar to the Roman one, was established here, but in a new atmosphere. It became clear, this was not just a duplicate of Rome, but its transformed reflection. The city received the rights of a capital in the year 337, 7 years after its founding. It grew and developed rapidly, becoming not only a political center, but also a place where a new imperial identity was formed. Residents began to perceive themselves not just as Romans, but as citizens of Constantinople, a city standing between worlds and connecting them. Already in the first decades after its founding, the city became a sacred space. Here, people not only lived and governed, they prayed, celebrated, and made crucial decisions. Constantinople became what the Athenian Acropolis or the Roman Forum was to antiquity, the heart where the pulse of the entire civilization beat. Thus arose a city that would live for over 1,000 years, survive sieges, destructions, and revivals, and become home to emperors, patriarchs, philosophers, and theologians. A city that, over time, would become synonymous with Byzantium. For when one says Byzantium, Constantinople is primarily recalled. After the death of Emperor Theodosius in the year 395, the Roman Empire officially split into two parts, East and West. His sons Arcadius and Honorius received, respectively, the eastern and western halves. Arcadius became emperor in Constantinople, Honorius in Milan, and later in Ravenna. This division of the empire is often perceived as a symbolic event, for in reality, East and West had long been moving in different directions. Even during the Council of Nicaea, it became evident how much their languages, customs, and even theology differed. The East spoke Greek, while the West retained Latin. Even participation in councils differed. Fewer Western bishops came, and they often needed translation. The cultural and mental divergence only deepened. The East was more urban, more philosophical. It preserved the Hellenistic heritage. The West, on the contrary, increasingly faced barbarian invasions, destruction of infrastructure, decline of cities, and loss of literary tradition. The West slowly slid into feudal fragmentation, while the East maintained a state structure, a monetary economy, and the traditions of ancient bureaucracy. The formal division of the empire also meant the final establishment of an independent Eastern Roman Empire, the very one we call Byzantium. Although the inhabitants of Constantinople would long consider themselves Romans, they already lived in a different political and spiritual reality. Their empire retained the structure and spirit of late antiquity, but at the same time became increasingly Christian, increasingly oriented towards Eastern liturgy, monasticism, and visionary theology. At the same time, the Western Empire plunged into a deep crisis. Barbarian tribes, Vandals, Goths, Franks, penetrated its territory, conquered provinces, and founded their kingdoms. In the year 476, the last Western emperor, the young Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic chieftain Odoacer. Symbolically, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, recognizing the Eastern emperor as the sole legitimate heir of Rome. From this moment, the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist as a political entity. But the East, that is, Byzantium, continued its history. It retained titles, symbolism, and the idea of universal power. However, this was already a different reality. This was not a Latin empire of jurists and conquerors. It was a Greek Christian empire, where the word logos meant both reason and revelation. Byzantium inherited Rome not literally, but as a semantic form. It became the support of the world, the axis of time, a temple in which eternity and history converged. The schism was not an end. It was the beginning of a new civilization, with its own language, theology, art, and perception of time. In the mid-5th century, the Byzantine Empire entered a new phase of its history, a phase of theological disputes that would shake its foundation. If the Council of Nicaea set the framework of faith, the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451 attempted to establish the final boundaries of the dogma concerning the nature of Jesus Christ. But instead of final unity, it became the cause of a serious schism, the consequences of which are still felt today. The occasion for the council was the turbulent debates about how the divine and human natures of Jesus Christ relate to each other. Already in previous decades, different interpretations had emerged. Some emphasized the duality of natures, others, their unity. The dispute between the Alexandrian and Antiochian schools reached its climax with Patriarch Dioscorus of Alexandria and Archimandrite Eutyches, who argued that after the Incarnation, only one divine nature remained in Christ. Emperor Marcion, striving to preserve ecclesiastical and political unity, convened an ecumenical council in the city of Chalcedon, on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, near Constantinople. More than 600 bishops gathered at the council. This was the largest assembly in the history of early Christianity. The sessions were held in the presence of imperial representatives and proceeded under strict control. The Council of Chalcedon rejected Eutyches' monophysite teaching as heresy and formulated the dogma of the two natures of Christ, unconfusedly, unchangeably, indivisibly, and inseparably. Jesus Christ is recognized as perfect God and perfect man. His two natures exist in one person, neither destroying nor merging with each other. This text, called the Chalcedonian definition, became the basis of Orthodox doctrine. But the adoption of this dogma provoked protest in Egypt, Syria, Armenia, and other eastern provinces. The local clergy and people refused to recognize the decisions of the council. Thus arose monophysitism, a movement asserting that in Christ there is only one divine human nature. These communities formed their own hierarchies, gradually separating from Constantinople and Rome. Byzantine emperors, striving for reconciliation, pursued a policy of compromise. For example, Emperor Zeno issued the Henoticon, a document designed to unite the different sides, avoiding rigid formulations. However, it caused discontent among both the Orthodox and the Monophysites. The schism between Constantinople and Rome became inevitable. The Roman Pope excommunicated Patriarch Acacius, and Byzantium found itself in a state of rupture with the Latin West for half a century. But most deeply, the schism penetrated into the empire itself. Monophysite regions, especially Egypt and Syria, became centers of opposition. Religious confrontation was superimposed on cultural and ethnic differences. Local elites felt alienated from the Hellenized power of Constantinople. This alienation would become one of the reasons for the empire's weakness during the Arab conquests. In the 7th century, the Council of Chalcedon was not just a theological act. It was a moment when Byzantium finally understood. Faith is not only an internal conviction, but also a political force capable of uniting or destroying. This was an era when dogma became the state foundation, and theology an arena of struggle for identity, power, and unity. The 6th century AD became an era of greatness and tension for Byzantium, centered around the figure of one of its most outstanding emperors, Justinian I. His reign, lasting almost 40 years, from the year 527 to the year 565, became a symbol of the Byzantine Renaissance. Ambitious reforms, large-scale constructions, theological disputes, and military campaigns. Justinian was born in the province of Illyricum to simple peasant parents, but thanks to his uncle Justin, who became emperor, he received an excellent education and access to power. Upon becoming ruler, Justinian sought not merely to govern, but to restore the former might of the Roman Empire, to revive its borders, laws, and glory, and at the same time to affirm Christianity as the core of the state. One of Justinian's main reforms was the codification of Roman law. He commissioned the eminent jurist Tribonian to compile a body of laws that unified and purified centuries of legal traditions. The result was the famous Justinian's Codification, which included the Institutes, Digests, Code, and subsequent novellae. This work had an enormous influence on European jurisprudence and became the basis for many future legal systems. Justinian also actively reformed the economy and provincial administration, striving to strengthen finances and improve tax collection. But his ambitions went further. He dreamed of restoring the empire's territorial unity. By his order, the outstanding general Belisarius began military campaigns. First, he defeated the Vandals in North Africa, then triumphed over the Ostrogoths in Italy, and for a time restored Rome to its former glory. Later, Narses' army defeated the Franks and Lombards. By the middle of the century, North Africa, part of Spain and Italy with Rome and Ravenna, were again under Byzantine control. However, this triumph concealed severe consequences. Devastated lands, an exhausted treasury, and ruined cities. Alongside military successes, Justinian engaged in great construction. The main monument of his era was the new church of Hagia Sophia, Hagia Sophia. Architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus created an architectural marvel in which Eastern mysticism combined with engineering daring. The enormous dome, soaring above the hall, symbolized the heavens descended to earth. This church became the spiritual center of the empire and a symbol of the entire Orthodox civilization. But Justinian's time was not only a time of triumph. In the year 541, the empire experienced a devastating epidemic, the plague, later named the Justinianic Plague. It claimed the lives of millions, undermined the economy, and caused a demographic crisis. In addition, the Nika riots, a popular uprising, almost cost the emperor his throne, only thanks to the empress. Theodora's decisiveness and the army's brutal actions was the rebellion suppressed and power preserved. Justinian also actively intervened in theological disputes. He supported the idea of unity of faith and sought to find formulas that would reconcile the supporters of the Council of Chalcedon and the Monophysites. His theological policy, though unsuccessful, shows how much faith was not a private matter for Byzantium, but a matter of state importance. Justinian's reign was the pinnacle of the early Byzantine period. It combined Roman heritage, Christian ideal, and Greek culture. And although after his death the empire reduced its possessions and faced new difficulties, the very idea of Byzantium as a Christian empire with a universal mission was finally established. The mid-7th century was a time of severe trials for Byzantium. Following the great era of Justinian, decades filled with upheavals ensued. The empire faced internal crises, religious disputes, and incessant wars. But especially terrible was the threat looming over the capital itself, Constantinople. In the year 626, the capital found itself under siege. Avaro-Slavic tribes, united with the Sasanian Persians, attempted to capture the city. This attack was particularly dangerous. Enemy forces surrounded Constantinople by land and by sea. The city was isolated, and at this time, Emperor Heraclius was far to the east, campaigning against the Persians. The defense of the capital was led by Patriarch Sergius. Together with the military commander Bonus, he mobilized the entire population, including monks and lay people, women, and the elderly. People strengthened the walls, organized prayer processions, and appealed to the Theotokos for help. It was then, according to tradition, that the akathist to the most holy Theotokos, invincible general, a prayer that became a symbol of hope and protection, was first performed. The siege ended in an unexpected defeat for the enemies. The Greek fleet delivered a decisive blow to the enemy ships, and the Avar warriors were forced to retreat. This salvation was perceived as a miracle. Since then, the conviction has been strengthened in Byzantine tradition. The Theotokos is the special patroness of Constantinople. But the troubles did not end there. In the same years, the Persians captured the most important eastern provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. In Jerusalem, they seized the Temple Mount and carried away the greatest relic, the true cross. The loss of these lands meant not only a political catastrophe but also a deep spiritual wound. Emperor Heraclius, one of the most charismatic rulers of his time, did not reconcile himself to this. He carried out a large-scale military reform, strengthened army discipline, and restored finances through a strict mobilization of resources. In the year 624, he began a retaliatory campaign. The campaign was long and difficult, but in the end, Byzantine troops inflicted a series of defeats on the Persians. The culmination was the victory at the Battle of Nineveh in the year 627. Soon, the Persian Shahanshah Khosrow II was overthrown, and Heraclius solemnly returned the true cross to Jerusalem. This was not just the return of a relic, it was an act of spiritual triumph, a symbol of revived faith and statehood. In these years, the empire seemed to have revived, but this victory turned out to be the last bright moment before a new storm. Already in the year 632, a new, unprecedented force, Islam, emerged on the historical stage. United under the green banner of the Prophet, the Arabs began a rapid conquest. Weakened provinces could not offer serious resistance. Within a few years, the Byzantines lost Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. Arab armies, inspired by a new faith, proved to be effective, fast, and cohesive. The old structure of the empire collapsed. The Roman East, with its patriarchates, monasteries, and schools, became a thing of the past. And yet even in this destruction, Byzantium retained its core. Constantinople stood firm. Its walls, the faith of its inhabitants, and the experience of previous generations made the impossible possible. From this moment, the empire would begin to change. It would become more compact, stricter, more ecclesiastical. The formation of new defensive structures, themes, and a new type of Byzantine life would begin. The siege and Heraclius's victory became a symbol of transition, from the ancient world to the medieval world, from an empire of former splendor to an empire of spiritual resistance. And it was this resistance, not by sword, but by prayer, not by numbers, but by faith, that would become the foundation of Byzantium's future. The mid-7th century was a time of severe trials for Byzantium. Following the great era of Justinian, decades filled with upheavals ensued. The empire faced internal crises, religious disputes, and incessant wars. But especially terrible was the threat looming over the capital itself, Constantinople. In the year 626, the capital found itself under siege. Avaro-Slavic tribes, united with the Sasanian Persians, attempted to capture the city. This attack was particularly dangerous. Enemy forces surrounded Constantinople by land and by sea. The city was isolated, and at this time, Emperor Heraclius was far to the east, campaigning against the Persians. The defense of the capital was led by Patriarch Sergius. Together with the military commander Bonus, he mobilized the entire population, including monks and lay people, women, and the elderly. People strengthened the walls, organized prayer processions, and appealed to the Theotokos for help. It was then, according to tradition, that the akathist to the most holy Theotokos, invincible general, a prayer that became a symbol of hope and protection, was first performed. The siege ended in an unexpected defeat for the enemies. The Greek fleet delivered a decisive blow to the enemy ships, and the Avar warriors were forced to retreat. This salvation was perceived as a miracle. Since then, the conviction has been strengthened in Byzantine tradition. The Theotokos is the special patroness of Constantinople, but the troubles did not end there. In the same years, the Persians captured the most important eastern provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. In Jerusalem, they seized the Temple Mount and carried away the greatest relic, the true cross. The loss of these lands meant not only a political catastrophe but also a deep spiritual wound. Emperor Heraclius, one of the most charismatic rulers of his time, did not reconcile himself to this. He carried out a large-scale military reform, strengthened army discipline, and restored finances through a strict mobilization of resources. In the year 624, he began a retaliatory campaign. The campaign was long and difficult, but in the end, Byzantine troops inflicted a series of defeats on the Persians. The culmination was the victory at the Battle of Nineveh in the year 627. Soon, the Persian Shahanshah Khosrow II was overthrown, and Heraclius solemnly returned the true cross to Jerusalem. This was not just the return of a relic, it was an act of spiritual triumph, a symbol of revived faith and statehood. In these years, the empire seemed to have revived. But this victory turned out to be the last bright moment before a new storm. Already in the year 632, a new, unprecedented force, Islam, emerged on the historical stage. United under the green banner of the Prophet, the Arabs began a rapid conquest. Weakened provinces could not offer serious resistance. Within a few years, the Byzantines lost Palestine, Syria, and Egypt. Arab armies, inspired by a new faith, proved to be effective, fast, and cohesive. The old structure of the empire collapsed. The Roman East, with its patriarchates, monasteries, and schools, became a thing of the past. And yet even in this destruction, Byzantium retained its core. Constantinople stood firm. Its walls, the faith of its inhabitants, and the experience of previous generations made the impossible possible. From this moment, the empire would begin to change. It would become more compact, stricter, more ecclesiastical. The formation of new defensive structures, themes, and a new type of Byzantine life would begin. The siege and Heraclius's victory became a symbol of transition, from the ancient world to the medieval world, from an empire of former splendor to an empire of spiritual resistance. And it was this resistance, not by sword, but by prayer, not by numbers, but by faith, that would become the foundation of Byzantium's future. After the victorious campaign of Emperor Heraclius and the return of the true cross, it seemed that Byzantium had regained its strength. But barely having felt the breath of peace, the empire faced a new, swift threat, the Islamic expansion, which forever changed the map of the East. This was not just a military onslaught. It was a clash of civilizations, systems of faith, culture, and power. The year 632 marks the beginning of the Arab conquest. Within one generation, Byzantium lost almost all of its eastern provinces, which for centuries had formed its foundation. First, Syria fell, then Palestine, and soon after, Egypt. Then the Arabs captured North Africa and moved further, all the way to the Iberian Peninsula. The reasons for such a rapid collapse were multifaceted. The eastern provinces had been exhausted by years of wars with Persia. The inhabitants were dissatisfied with high taxation and centralized power. In addition, a significant part of the population professed monophysitism, a movement rejected by the official church. These people often perceived the Arabs not as enemies, but as liberators from the oppression of Constantinople. The loss of Egypt was particularly painful. Egypt was not only the granary of the empire, but also a spiritual stronghold, with great monasteries, theological schools, and holy sites. Along with Egypt, Byzantium also lost a key resource: papyrus. This seriously impacted book culture. The production of manuscripts decreased, books became rare, and literacy began to decline even in the capital. The fall of the East also affected the church structure. 3 of the 5 patriarchates, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem, came under Muslim rule. Byzantium became an isolated church, where the Patriarch of Constantinople remained the only center of power in the Orthodox world. This strengthened the sacred role of the capital and the emperor, but at the same time confined the faith within narrower boundaries. the empire's economy experienced a crisis. Trade routes were cut off, taxes decreased, and the army lost its supplies. Small towns in the Balkans and Asia Minor emptied or turned into fortifications. The empire contracted, losing its expanse, but sought depth. Against this backdrop of decline, a special type of Byzantine civilization began to form, more ascetic, spiritually focused, surviving under constant threat. Monasteries became strongholds of education, centers of prayer and production. Icons, liturgies, and theology acquired special significance as spiritual pillars of a world where earthly guarantees no longer applied. Intellectual life also changed. Secular historiography was replaced by religious literature. Former chronicles gave way to hagiographies, lives of saints, in which true history was experienced as a spiritual experience. The world no longer seemed manageable. It was perceived as a trial, a path, an ascetic feat. And yet, despite these catastrophes, Byzantium did not disappear. It compressed like a ring, but became stronger internally. A new era began, an era of survival, prayer, and symbol. It was, at this time, that Byzantine identity was formed in its mature form. As a fortress of spirit amidst a changing world, Constantinople, remaining unconquered, became not just a capital, but also a spiritual center. Here the memory of former greatness was preserved, but a new sense of mission was also born. Byzantium no longer claimed to rule the world. It preserved the truth in a world that was becoming increasingly alien. The 8th century became a time of internal upheavals for Byzantium, comparable in significance to external military threats. Against the backdrop of incessant wars with the Arabs and Bulgarians, territorial losses, and economic weakening, a deep religious crisis erupted, known in history as iconoclasm, one of the most complex and painful periods of Byzantine history. The official beginning of the iconoclastic movement is considered to be the decree of Emperor Leo III, the Isaurian, issued around the year 726. He forbade the veneration of icons, ordered their destruction, and began a campaign against the depiction of sacred figures. However, the roots of iconoclasm run deeper, into the religious, cultural, and political fabric of Byzantine society. Criticism of icon veneration had existed before, both within Byzantium and beyond its borders. The main argument of icon opponents was the accusation of idolatry. How can one depict an invisible God, enclose the divine in paint and wood? Proponents of this approach referred to the Old Testament, to the commandment, "You shall not make for yourself an idol." In addition to theological reasons, there were also political motives. In the face of threats from Muslims who categorically rejected the depiction of God, and after a series of military defeats, part of the Byzantine elite concluded that the cause of their failures was divine wrath for violating the commandments. Emperors sought symbolic renewal and spiritual purification of the empire. The first phase of iconoclasm occurred during the reigns of Leo III and his son Constantine V. Decrees forbade not only icons, but also relics of saints, holy images on coins. Churches were cleansed of frescoes, mosaics, and iconostases were destroyed. Monasteries, the custodians of icon veneration, suffered particularly severely. Monks were persecuted, expelled, some were tortured and executed. However, iconoclasm also met with serious resistance. Many believers perceived the destruction of icons as an act of sacrilege. Monks in particular, John of Damascus, who wrote his works already in Arab Damascus, and later Theodore the Studite, abbot of the capital's Studion monastery, defended icon veneration with particular steadfastness. These theologians formulated important ideas. An icon is not an image of God's essence, but an embodiment of his coming into the world. Christ became visible, therefore, he can be depicted. The dispute acquired not only a religious but also a philosophical dimension. It touched upon the very understanding of matter and spirit. the role of art, and the meaning of the Incarnation. Icon veneration affirmed the possibility of sanctifying the visible, of matter as a conduit of grace. This was the foundation of Byzantine aesthetics and liturgical culture. Internal tension grew. Emperors sought to assert control over the church, while the clergy and monasticism sought to preserve canonical tradition. The empire seemed to split into two camps: secular power, striving for simplification, and spiritual power, preserving mystical depth. After the death of Constantine V and the short reigns of his successors, a gradual softening of policy began. In the year 787, Empress Irene convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which officially restored the veneration of icons. The council recognized icons as worthy of veneration, but not of worship, distinguishing between the veneration of the image and the worship of God. This formula would become a dogma of the Orthodox Church. Nevertheless, iconoclasm did not completely disappear. In the second quarter of the 9th century, it would flare up again under Emperor Leo V, the Armenian. Only in the year 843, under Empress Theodora and Patriarch Methodius, would icon veneration be finally restored. From this time on, every year on the first Sunday of Great Lent, Byzantium celebrates the triumph of orthodoxy, the day of the icon's victory over heresy. Thus concluded one of the most tense centuries in the life of the empire. Iconoclasm showed how fragile the balance was between power and faith, between the visible and the invisible, between idea and image. But from this struggle a new depth was born, theological, artistic, and spiritual, and it became the basis for all further development of the Byzantine world. After more than a century of disputes, persecutions, and theological battles, Byzantium finally entered a phase of reconciliation. The victory of the icon venerators was not just a restoration of an ancient custom, but a symbol of spiritual healing, a return to harmony between power and church. The era of iconoclasm ended, leaving a deep mark on the empire's consciousness. The final triumph of orthodoxy is associated with the name of Empress Theodora, the widow of the iconoclast emperor Theophilos. After his death in the year 842, she took power into her own hands as regent for her young son Michael III. Despite the pressure from the iconoclastic elite, Theodora made a fateful decision: to restore the venerations of icons and put an end to the long-standing schism. Together with Patriarch Methodius, a theologian of high culture and moderation, she organized a solemn liturgy in the capital, dedicated to the return of icons to the churches. This took place in March of the year 843, on the first Sunday of Great Lent. This day was named the Triumph of Orthodoxy, and has since been celebrated annually as a reminder of the victory of truth over heresy. Church services were held with special solemnity. Icons of the Theotokos, Christ, and saints reappeared in churches. Monasteries restored their ruined relics, and exiled icon painters returned. A new phase in the development of Byzantine culture began. But most importantly, an internal reinterpretation occurred. The icon ceased to be a subject of dispute and became the heart of Orthodox life. In theology, the doctrine formulated by John of Damascus and Theodore the Studite was finally affirmed. An icon is not just an image, it is a window into another world, a path to the invisible through the visible. It combines faith and matter, prayer and art. It becomes an integral part of the liturgy, spiritual practice, and way of life. The triumph of orthodoxy also signified a new alliance between church and state. Empress Theodora, acting against the line of her late husband, showed an example of piety, wisdom, and political foresight. Patriarch Methodius pursued a moderate policy. He sought reconciliation, did not persecute iconoclasts, but called for repentance and forgiveness. This was a rare example of a religious victory that did not initiate a new wave of violence. From this time, Byzantium entered a period of relative spiritual stability. Monastic culture revived. The founding of new monasteries, primarily in Asia Minor and on Mount Athos, became a symbol of renewal. Manuscript workshops returned, book culture developed, and liturgical genres and hagiography flourished. Icon painting also experienced a renaissance. New styles emerged, symbolism was enriched, and theological content deepened. The icon became not just a part of the church, but its center. Church building also changed. They were now designed with an iconographic program in mind, and architecture, painting, and chanting combined into a single liturgical whole. Politically, Byzantium was still vulnerable. The empire had not regained its former territory, and enemies remained active in the Balkans and Asia Minor. However, after so many years of internal strife, the empire finally felt an internal harmony, a sense that, despite external threats, its spirit remained whole and alive. The triumph of orthodoxy was not only a theological event, but also a starting point for a new Byzantine identity. It was a return to the source, a purification after the storm, a restoration of harmony between heaven and earth, image and word, faith and form. From now on, the icon was no longer a subject of dispute, but a light illuminating the path of an entire people. After a century-long crisis caused by iconoclastic disputes, Byzantium entered a new era, an era of internal revival, when spirit, knowledge, and culture once again became central to the empire's life. This was the 9th century AD, a time when the Christian East not only recovered from upheavals, but also reformulated its identity. One of the symbols of this revival is the figure of Patriarch Photios. He came from an educated family, received a brilliant secular and theological education, knew several languages, and was an outstanding rhetorician and connoisseur of ancient Greek literature. Before becoming patriarch, he was a layman and a diplomat, but his intellectual authority and moral strength made him an ideal candidate for the See of Constantinople. Photios became patriarch in a complex political situation. His predecessor had been overthrown by Emperor Michael III, and Photios himself found himself at the center of a conflict between the church and state, as well as between Constantinople and Rome. This conflict, known as the Photian Schism, was the first serious manifestation of the schism between the Eastern and Western churches. The essence of the dispute was not only in ecclesiastical politics, but also in the deep differences between East and West. Roman popes insisted on the primacy of their jurisdiction, while Constantinople sought equality and conciliarity. In addition, theological disagreements arose in particular about the addition of the Latin interpolation filioque and from the Son to the Creed, concerning the procession of the Holy Spirit. Photios firmly defended fidelity to ancient doctrine and canonical order. The Photian era is marked not only by conflict, but also by cultural flourishing. Under the Patriarch and Emperor Michael III, new schools, libraries, and monasteries began to be established. A special role was played by the so-called Photian Library, Myrio-Biblon, an encyclopedic work that collected excerpts from hundreds of ancient and Christian authors, many of which have not survived to us in their entirety. Thus, Photios became not only a theologian and political figure, but also a guardian of the memory of classical heritage. This time also saw an increase in missionary activity. The Byzantine Church sent preachers to Slavic lands. The brothers Cyril and Methodius, sent to Great Moravia, created the Slavic alphabet. Glagolitic and later Cyrillic emerged. The translation of liturgical books into Slavic became the beginning of the Christianization of the Slavs and the formation of an entire new civilization that inherited Byzantine faith and culture. Internal revival manifested itself in architecture, painting, and literature. There was an interest in systematic knowledge, compilations, and encyclopedias. New chronicles and lives of saints were compiled, and hymnographic cycles were created. Monasteries became not only spiritual centers but also schools, workshops, and libraries. The personality of a saint was no longer just a model of asceticism, but also a cultural authority. The sacred space of the church acquired a special richness. The system of icons, frescoes, and mosaics, organized according to a theological program, became increasingly important. The church was not just a place of prayer, but an image of the cosmos brought into harmony. It combined history, eschatology, and the theology of light. This spiritual revival did not mean a rejection of the world. 9th century Byzantium was a self-confident power, pursuing an active foreign policy, capable of defending itself and influencing its neighbors. But most importantly, it was a power that regained its internal integrity. It knew who it was, the guardian of the Orthodox faith, the heir to ancient wisdom, the cultural and spiritual center of the Christian world. Thus, from the ashes of iconoclasm, from the shadow of past upheavals, Byzantium rose as a civilization of the spirit, in which truth is expressed not only by word, but by image, not only by dogma, but by the light of prayer. And this awakening was only just beginning. After a century of crisis caused by the iconoclastic disputes, Byzantium entered a new golden age, a period known as the Macedonian Renaissance. It received its name from the dynasty tracing its origins to Emperor Basil I the Macedonian. Although the dynasty's origin is linked to the Asia Minor provinces, not historical Macedonia, it was under these rulers that the empire reached the zenith of its cultural, military, and administrative power. Basil I came to power in the year 867 as a result of a palace coup, ending the reign of Michael III. He proved to be not only a charismatic leader but also a far-sighted administrator. With his reforms, Basil laid a solid foundation for future prosperity. He pursued a strict policy of strengthening power, limiting the influence of court cliques, redistributing land, and establishing order in the tax system. However, the true flourishing came under his descendants, especially under Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitos. Constantine was not a great general, but he became an example of a Byzantine sage on the throne. His reign, from the year 913 to the year 959, was a time of flourishing literature, history, theology, jurisprudence, and encyclopedic science. By Constantine's order, extensive reference works were created for future rulers. De Administrando Imperio, on the administration of the empire. De Ceremoniis Aulae Byzantinae, on the ceremonies of the Byzantine court. On the themes, administrative military units. These works not only provide insight into the internal structure of the state, but also demonstrate a special type of Byzantine thinking, the desire to systematize, preserve, and transmit knowledge as a spiritual heritage. The cultural revival of this period also encompassed theology, hagiography, liturgical poetry, and hymnography developed. The so-called Holy Mountain style of icon painting emerged, strict, sublime, and rich in symbols. Monasteries became the main cultural centers. Books were written and copied there. Art and architecture developed. At the same time, the empire strengthened its position in the international arena. The army was modernized. The theme system, military administrative division, was streamlined. Fortresses were built, and supplies were improved. On the eastern borders, Byzantium gradually recaptured territories from the Arabs, consolidating its influence in Armenia and Georgia. In the Balkans, the empire confronted the Bulgarians, Hungarians, and Slavic princes, often acting not so much by sword as by diplomacy and ecclesiastical mission. Of particular note is the Byzantine mission to Kiev and Rus. At the end of the 10th century, under Emperor Basil II, Prince Vladimir Sviatoslavich was baptized. This was linked to the conclusion of a dynastic alliance between Rus and Byzantium. Vladimir married the Byzantine princess Anna, which was an unprecedented event. From this moment, Rus definitively entered the orbit of Byzantine Christianity and culture. The Macedonian Renaissance was also characterized by a desire for legal regularization of life. Emperor Leo VI the Wise issued a large-scale code of laws, the Basilica, a systematized and adapted version of Justinian's code, translated into Greek. This made law more accessible and the imperial tradition more stable. The empire at this time not only survived, it found a second wind. Constantinople became the largest city in Europe. According to various estimates, it was home to 200 to 400,000 people. The streets were paved, aqueducts supplied water, liturgies were sung in churches, and thousands of spectators gathered at the hippodrome. The city became a model of order, beauty, and grandeur. This was a mature Byzantium, self-confident, rooted in faith, rich in experience and culture. Its model of governance, its school of diplomacy, its liturgy and theology became benchmarks for neighboring civilizations. It did not seek to conquer, it sought to influence, and it was in this influence that its strength was manifested. By the end of the 10th century, Byzantium reached the zenith of its political and military power. Within a few decades of the Macedonian dynasty's rule, the empire once again became a great power in the eastern Mediterranean. But just as every ascent has a limit, so too did Byzantium's golden age gradually begin to enter a phase of overexertion and tension. One of the most outstanding Byzantine rulers, Basil II, nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer by the people, ascended the throne. He ruled for almost 50 years, from the year 976 to the year 1025. His reign was marked by military triumphs, administrative strictness, and an unyielding will for centralized power. From a young age, Basil faced rebellions and aristocratic claims to the throne. Powerful families such as the Scleri and Phocas opposed him, but Basil managed to overcome internal enemies, strengthened the army, and embarked on external conquests, primarily in the Balkans. The Bulgarian kingdom, which had resisted Byzantium for decades, became the main target of his military campaign. After a long and bloody war, Basil inflicted a decisive defeat on the Bulgarians at Kleidion in the year 1014. According to tradition, he ordered 15,000 captured Bulgarians to be blinded, leaving one one-eyed guide for every 100. This terrible act earned him the nickname Bulgar Slayer, and the empire full control over all of Bulgaria. Basil's victory made the Balkans Byzantine and restored Constantinople's direct influence all the way to the Danube. However, this apex was also accompanied by hidden tension. Basil was a harsh administrator, pursued a policy of centralization, and actively fought against the arbitrary rule of the provincial nobility. He issued decrees limiting the expansion of large landowners' estates, dynasties that accumulated wealth at the expense of peasants. Lands illegally acquired by feudal lords were returned to the treasury. This policy caused discontent among the nobility, but preserved the basis of the imperial economy. Basil did not seek pomp. He was ascetic, lived simply, worked hard, and rarely held solemn ceremonies. His image was that of a warrior sovereign who placed duty above personal interests. But despite his successes, he left no heir. After his death in the year 1025, power passed to his less capable relatives. Immediately after Basil's death, it became obvious how much in the empire depended solely on his personal energy. A gradual weakening of discipline began, the return of aristocratic influence, and the proliferation of court intrigues. Emperors became less and less independent and more dependent on bureaucracy and court cliques. One after another, representatives of aristocratic families appeared on the throne. Legislation, once strict and effective, began to be violated. The financial system was destabilized, the army was reduced, and land reform was curtailed. All this did not yet destroy the empire, but it undermined its stability. Nevertheless, even during this period, Byzantium remained a great power. Its diplomacy was active in Europe and the East, its culture maintained authority, and Constantinople continued to be the center of the Christian world. However, the empire increasingly faced the need to defend not so much its borders as the very structure of its existence. Basil's limits were not only territorial, but also internal. His reign showed the possibilities of absolute power, but also its vulnerability. After him, the empire seemed to freeze, on the edge of an era, on the eve of a new time that would bring new challenges, even harsher and more unpredictable. The beginning of the 11th century for Byzantium was a time of greatness concealing internal cracks. After the death of Emperor Basil II, the Bulgar slayer in the year 1025, the empire entered a period of instability. At first glance, Byzantium was still strong. Its territories were vast, the capital flourished, and the church was united. But the foundation on which imperial stability rested began to gradually crumble. Basil's successors proved to be weak rulers. They possessed neither his will nor his strategic thinking. The imperial court became an arena for the struggle of court factions, eunuchs, nobles, and generals. At the same time, the system that Basil had kept in balance began to disintegrate. Officials sold positions, large landowners again absorbed peasant plots, and the army lost its combat effectiveness. A particular threat was the growing power of the aristocracy in the provinces. Influential families, the Komnenoi, Dukai, Delianoi, gradually became local rulers, weakening the vertical of power. At the same time, imperial power lost its sacred meaning and was increasingly perceived as a prize in a political struggle, rather than a divine institution. Against this backdrop, external threats became increasingly significant. In the West, the Normans grew stronger. In the Balkans, Slavic movements revived. And most importantly, in the East, a new, rapidly growing force emerged: the Seljuk Turks. These were Turkic peoples, professing Islam and distinguished by high military organization. After capturing Baghdad in the year 1055, they began an active advance into Asia Minor, a key province of Byzantium, the source of its human and food resources. The situation reached a critical point in the year 1071, when the Byzantine army led by Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes clashed with the Seljuks at the Battle of Manzikert. Despite numerical superiority, the Byzantines suffered a crushing defeat. The emperor was captured, the army was routed, and discipline and administration collapsed. Manzikert became a symbol not just of military collapse, but of the loss of strategic initiative. The defeat at Manzikert led to catastrophic consequences. In the following years, the Seljuks captured most of Asia Minor, advanced to the Aegean coast, and crossed the internal regions once inhabited by Greek Christian peasantry. Agriculture declined, taxation weakened, and the empire lost its resource base. Within the country, new rebellions began. Emperors were overthrown, new dynasties ascended, and provinces broke away from the center. Amidst this chaos, the church maintained relative stability, but even it was no longer able to unite society as it had during the iconoclastic era. And yet, despite massive losses, Byzantium did not disappear. The empire shrank, but did not perish. In Constantinople, the administration still functioned, services were held, books, mosaics, and churches were created. But this was already a different empire, vulnerable, besieged, seeking salvation in diplomacy and faith. The turn of the millennium was for Byzantium not only a geopolitical crisis but also a symbolic one, a time when the old world structure was crumbling, and the new one had not yet taken shape. The empire experienced the loss of old supports, facing the question, can it survive if its glory remained in the past? Byzantium would seek the answer to this question in the subsequent chapters of its history, through trials, betrayal, faith, and hope. At the end of the 11th century, Byzantium faced a new and unexpected force, coming not from the east, but from the west. Western Europe, having survived its dark ages, had by this time begun to revive. Cities grew, kingdoms strengthened, and new religious movements appeared. Against this backdrop, the idea of papal authority over the entire Christian oikumene strengthened in Rome, and it was from there that the movement began that would change the fate of Byzantium: the Crusades. The idea of a crusade was first formulated in the speech of Pope Urban II at Clermont in the year 1095. He called on Western Christians to go to the east to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. However, the soldiers, feudal lords, adventurers, and pilgrims who responded to this call moved not only to Jerusalem, they passed through the lands of the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, ruling in Constantinople from the year 1081, initially viewed this movement with hope. He saw in the Crusaders a possible help against the Seljuks, who threatened the remnants of Byzantine possessions in Asia Minor. Alexios proposed a logical alliance. He would provide assistance to the Crusaders, and they, in turn, would undertake to return the captured territories to Byzantium. Byzantine diplomacy organized the Crusaders' crossing of the Bosphorus, supplied them with provisions, and directed them deep into Anatolia. The initial successes were indeed encouraging. The Byzantines regained some cities and strengthened their borders. However, it quickly became clear that between Byzantium and the West, there were not only political, but also deep cultural, religious, and mental differences. The Crusaders considered themselves warriors of God, acting by the will of the Pope. They did not understand the complex Byzantine politics, which combined diplomacy with military caution. On the contrary, the Byzantines perceived the Crusaders as an unpredictable force, often crude, fanatical, and prone to looting. Mutual distrust escalated into open irritation. The Crusaders considered the Byzantines cowards and heretics, while the Byzantines considered the Crusaders barbarians. The exacerbation reached its peak during the Second and Third Crusades, but the tragic culmination came with the Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade, launched in the year 1198, was initially supposed to lead the army to Egypt via a sea route. However, the Crusaders, lacking funds to pay for the fleet, agreed to the Venetians' terms, first to besiege Zara, a city belonging to Catholics but competing with Venice. This already indicated that the ideals of the cross were giving way to greed. Then a turning point occurred. The Crusaders directed their forces toward Constantinople. The reason was a dynastic conflict. The deposed Byzantine prince Alexios Angelos promised them huge sums for his restoration to the throne. The Crusaders accepted the offer, and in the year 1204, they stormed Constantinople. The city, once majestic and sacred, was subjected to brutal plunder. Churches were desecrated, monasteries destroyed, and relics carried off to Europe. Even Hagia Sophia became a place of violence and mockery. Byzantine chroniclers described these days as the fall of the Second Rome, as the end of the world. In place of Byzantium, the Latin Empire arose, a pseudo-state entity ruled by Western feudal lords. Byzantine elites fled, creating states in exile: the Empire of Nicaea, the Empire of Trebizond, and the Despotate of Epirus. However, there was no unity among them. This event not only destroyed the political integrity of Byzantium, but also forever shattered trust between East and West. The Great Schism between Orthodoxy and Catholicism, which began in the 11th century, now received bloody confirmation. The Crusaders, who came to defend the faith, became destroyers of holy sites. The collapse of Constantinople in the year 1204 was not just the fall of a city. It was a deep cultural and spiritual breakdown. A world that seemed enduring disappeared in the smoke of fires, and the ringing of captured bells. But the history of Byzantium did not end there. After the fall of Constantinople in the year 1204, it seemed that the history of the Byzantine Empire had reached its tragic end. The capital was plundered, churches desecrated, and imperial power swept away. In place of the former power, the Latin Empire emerged, a state created by Western European feudal lords who knew neither the Byzantine language, nor its traditions, nor its spirit. And yet, Byzantium did not disappear. Its spirit, its elite, its ecclesiastical and cultural tradition found refuge in exile. Within a few months of the capital's capture, 3 new centers emerged, claiming to be the guardians of the Byzantine heritage: the Empire of Nicaea in Western Asia Minor, the Empire of Trebizond on the Pontic coast, and the Despotate of Epirus in the Balkans. Of all 3, the Empire of Nicaea became the main successor to Constantinople. Its capital, the city of Nicaea, formerly the site of ecumenical councils, now became the residence of the exiled emperors. The ruling dynasty of the Laskarids, and later the Palaiologoi, preserved the most important institutions of imperial power: the Senate, the Patriarchate, the army, and the laws. The period of the Nicaean Empire's existence was a time of restoration. Surviving monasteries, scholars, theologians, and artists moved there. Books were again written, icons created, and divine services restored. The Patriarch of Constantinople, elected in exile, continued his service, maintaining the moral integrity of the Orthodox world. The emperors in Nicaea pursued an energetic policy. They waged wars with the Latins, strengthened borders, and maintained the army. Special attention was paid to education and the church. The empire in exile relied not on luxury, but on the strength of spirit. The Nicene theological school became one of the most significant in the history of late Byzantium. A turning point came in the year 1261. Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos, possessing a rare gift for military and diplomatic strategy, captured Constantinople and restored Byzantine power in the capital. This happened without a large-scale war. The Latin rulers in the city proved weak and demoralized, and Byzantine detachments penetrated the capital and opened the gates. The recapture of Constantinople was not only a political event, but also a sacred one. The Byzantines perceived it as a miracle, a sign of God's providence. The Palaiologoi solemnly entered the city, resumed services in Hagia Sophia, and restored palaces and fortifications. The empire regained its heart. But the new Byzantium was no longer the great power it had been under Justinian or Basil II. Its territories were significantly reduced, its economy exhausted, and its population diminished. Constantinople suffered greatly. Many buildings were destroyed, artisan quarters were deserted, and its former splendor was lost. Nevertheless, a cultural revival began. During the Palaiologan period, there was a surge in philosophy, theology, and art. The so-called Palaiologan Renaissance emerged, a phenomenon in many ways similar to the Western European Renaissance. Scholars again turned to ancient thought. Monks recopied the texts of Plato and Aristotle, and artists created exquisite frescoes and mosaics. A special place in this period is occupied by mystical theology. The most prominent representative, Gregory Palamas, Archbishop of Thessalonica, developed the teaching on intellectual prayer and divine light. His ideas are reflected in hesychasm, a monastic practice of contemplation and inner stillness. These ideas would become dominant in Orthodox spirituality for centuries to come. Despite the restoration of power, the empire constantly balanced between survival and decline. Threats came from all sides: Serbs, Bulgarians, Latins, and later, Ottoman Turks. Emperors conducted difficult negotiations, trying to conclude unions with Rome for military aid, but each time faced resistance from the people and clergy. Returning from the ashes was not a triumph in the Roman sense. It was spiritual, steadfastness, survival against all odds, the preservation of essence in conditions of disintegration. The empire no longer sought to conquer, it sought to remain itself. And this became its last feat. By the 14th century, Byzantium, despite the restoration of its capital and a period of cultural revival, had become a weakened power, torn by internal conflicts and external threats. Its territories shrank to the limits of Thrace, parts of Macedonia, and a few islands. Constantinople remained magnificent but impoverished, and the empire itself, a symbol of former greatness, was surrounded by the growing shadow of the East. In the East, a new powerful force arose, the Ottoman Turks. Unlike the Seljuks, they did not merely threaten the fringes. They began a systematic advance, subjugating Greek cities in Asia Minor, penetrating the Balkans, and gradually encircling Byzantine lands. The Ottoman army was mobile, disciplined, and inspired by the idea of jihad. Byzantium could not oppose them with either military or economic force. Within the empire, dynastic crises occurred. The descendants of Michael VIII, Palaiologos, Andronikos, John, Constantine, fought for the throne, entering into alliances with Latins, Serbs, Bulgarians, and even Turks, just to retain power. Often these alliances proved ruinous. Cities were plundered, lands lost, and the people demoralized. The emperors began to seek salvation in the West. They offered a church union, the unification of the Eastern and Western churches under the supremacy of the Pope, in exchange for military aid. However, the idea of union met with sharp rejection within Byzantium itself. The people, clergy, and monasticism rejected Latin interference in matters of faith. One of the Palamite theologians even said, "Better a Turkish turban than a Latin's tiara." Despite its weakness, Byzantium continued to live. Constantinople remained a city of churches, monasteries, and schools. Manuscripts were copied here, grammar and rhetoric were taught, and disputes about the nature of light and God's grace were held. The last surge of Byzantine philosophy is associated with the names of Nicholas Cabasilas, John Cucuzalis, and Gemistus Plethon. Some of them even anticipated the ideals of the Renaissance. The city prepared for the worst. Walls were restored, towers strengthened, and grain supplies gathered. The last emperors, especially John VIII and Constantine XX Palaiologos, recognized the inevitability of the end, but maintained their courage. The Byzantine elite increasingly contemplated eternity, the meaning of suffering and death as a transition, not as disappearance. Beggars and monks roamed the streets of Constantinople, and above the city still rose the domes of Hagia Sophia, reflecting the last rays of Byzantine culture. This city, like a ship drifting in the stormy sea of history, was still illuminated by an inner light. The siege seemed inevitable. The Ottomans rose in the Balkans, conquered Adrianople and Thessaloniki, built a fleet, and approached Constantinople itself. With each passing year, the noose tightened. Byzantium was now almost only a city-state, surrounded by enemies, but full of memories of glory, faith, and meaning. And so, on the eve of the last battle, the empire became not a space, but a symbol. Its walls were walls of prayer. Its battle was a battle not for land, but for the soul. The last gates were not only of stone, but of spirit. And beyond them, Byzantium as it was, eternal though mortal, glorious in the silence before the storm. In the spring of the year 1453, the last shadows gathered over Constantinople. The Ottoman army, led by the young Sultan Mehmed II, nicknamed Fatih, the Conqueror, approached the capital. He intended to put an end to the 1,000-year existence of the Byzantine Empire and make Constantinople his capital. Mehmed prepared meticulously. He erected forts, strengthened the fleet, and acquired artillery. A colossal cannon, cast by the Hungarian engineer Urban, capable of destroying even the strongest walls, would play a special role. Byzantium at this time was almost solely Constantinople and a few surviving forts. Emperor Constantine II Palaiologos, a man of strong will and piety, understood that saving the city was practically impossible. But he did not abandon his post. He rejected offers of salvation and abdication, deciding to share the fate of the capital to the end. The city's defense was organized with all available forces. The population, about 50,000 people, included women and children. The army, fewer than 7,000 warriors, included Italian and Spanish mercenaries, especially Genoese under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani. Against them, Mehmed's army numbered up to 100,000 people, including heavy artillery, a fleet, and sapper detachments. The siege began on April 6th. For almost 2 months, Constantinople held out. The defenders heroically repelled assaults, extinguished fires, and reinforced breached sections of the walls. At night, liturgies were held in churches, processions walked the streets, and the akathist to the Most Holy Theotokos was recited. The city seemed to repel the onslaught of time with prayer. But each day brought tragedy closer. The Turks built bridges across the Golden Horn, transported ships overland, and weakened the walls. Inside the city, tension was palpable. Supplies were running low. Giustiniani was wounded and left his position, causing panic. And so, on the night of May 29th, the Ottomans launched a general assault. In 3 waves, they advanced on the walls. The first, lightly armed. The second, regular units. The third, elite janissaries. After fierce resistance, the defense collapsed. One of the enemy detachments found a breach near the Kirkoporta gate. Turkish soldiers penetrated the city. Emperor Constantine, removing his imperial regalia, entered the battle with a sword in hand. He died among his warriors, like the last Roman Caesar. The Church of Hagia Sophia filled with people seeking refuge. When the Ottomans entered the church, the last liturgy was being sung. According to legend, one of the priests disappeared into the altar, entered the wall, to someday complete the service again. The city was captured. The looting began. According to the laws of war of those times, the city was given over to the mercy of the victors for 3 days. Houses, monasteries, and churches were plundered. Relics were carried off to Istanbul, Athens, and Venice. Hagia Sophia was converted into a mosque. But Mehmed did not destroy the city. He wanted Constantinople to become the jewel of his empire. With the fall of Constantinople, Byzantium, the last stronghold of the Roman Empire, passed into eternity. More than 1,000 years of history came to an end. But this was not just the end of a state. It was the end of a civilization in which faith, word, and image merged into a single form of life. The fall did not lead to oblivion. It became the beginning of memory. In the Russian tradition, the idea of the Third Rome was established, Moscow as the successor to Constantinople. In Europe, Byzantine scholars participated in the formation of the Renaissance. And in Orthodox liturgy, prayers written in Constantinople, a city that fell but did not disappear, still resonate. After the fall of Constantinople in the year 1453, the history of Byzantium did not end. It changed form. The political shell disappeared, the walls collapsed, the thrones were extinguished, but the spirit of the empire continued to live. It remained in books, in rituals, in chanting, in theology, and most importantly, in the people, who carried the memory of Byzantium beyond its borders. Many scholars, monks, and artisans left the ruined capital and moved to other lands. One of the main destinations was Western Europe. Byzantine theologians and philologists arrived in Italian cities: Venice, Florence, Rome. Among them were George Gemistus Plathon, John Argyropoulos, Bessarion of Nicaea, and many others. These people brought with them manuscripts of Plato, Aristotle, Plutarch, works of the Church Fathers, and texts in ancient Greek, which by that time had been almost forgotten in the West. It was this knowledge that would catalyze the Renaissance. Italian humanists, previously familiar with antiquity only through Latin adaptations, gained access to the originals. Greek thought, combined with Christian tradition, opened a new horizon for philosophy, science, and art. The Renaissance did not arise out of nothing. Its spark was brought by the inhabitants of the fallen Constantinople. On the other hand, in the Orthodox East, the idea of succession began to form. In Moscow, the capital of Rus, symbolic thinking was affirmed. Rome fell, Byzantium, the second Rome, was destroyed, but Moscow remained. The concept of the Third Rome emerged, first clearly formulated by the monk Philotheus. Moscow princes, having entered into a dynastic marriage with Sophia Palaiologina, the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, began to perceive themselves as successors of the Byzantine tradition. Along with church rituals, icon painting, and architecture, Russia also adopted the idea of a sacred empire, a kingdom preserving the Orthodox faith until the end of time. The title Tsar itself, derived from Caesar, became fixed for the Moscow sovereigns. The Russian church became a patriarchate, gained independence, and affirmed the Byzantine canon in liturgy and mystical tradition. The influence of Byzantium also persisted in the Balkan countries, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania. Even under Ottoman rule, in the monasteries of Mount Athos and Meteora, in the churches of Ohrid and Pech, Byzantine chanting continued, manuscripts were copied, and hagiography was written. These were cultural islands where the ancient empire lived on in its quiet, unseen existence. The legacy of Byzantium is also evident in its architecture. Domed churches, built according to the Byzantine model, were erected in Kiev, Novgorod, Moscow, Iași, and Sofia. The cross-shaped plan, mosaics, iconostases, and bright frescoes all became distinctive features of Eastern Christian church culture. The icon, a central symbol of Byzantine spirituality, continued to live and develop. In the Greek, Russian, and Balkan traditions, icon painting did not disappear. On the contrary, in the post-Byzantine era, many schools emerged, including the famous Cretan school, associated with the names of Michael Damaskinos and El Greco. The icon became not only an object of worship, but also a form of spiritual memory. Liturgical texts composed by Byzantine authors, John of Damascus, Cosmas of Mayuma, Romanos the Melodist, still resonate in Orthodox churches around the world. Vespers, Matins, and the liturgies of saints, John Chrysostom and Basil the Great, retain the rhythm and depth created by generations of Byzantine monks. Thus, Byzantium as a state disappeared, but as a civilization it remained. It did not die. It dispersed. It became the invisible foundation of cultures and churches, an inspiration for artists and thinkers, a light that continues to illuminate the path even when its source seems extinguished. Centuries have passed since the walls of Constantinople fell under the blows of Ottoman artillery, since the liturgies in Hagia Sophia fell silent, since the silhouette of the Byzantine Empire disappeared from the world maps. But has it truly disappeared? Byzantium did not just live in fortresses and decrees. It lived in the breath of prayer, in the radiance of icons, in the rhythm of hymns, in the very way of looking at the world as a reflection of the heavenly order. Its disappearance was not an end, but a transition. Byzantium dissolved into the cultures it inspired, into the heritage it passed on. It became a quiet light, not blinding, but constant. A light that burns through the centuries in churches, books, hearts. This civilization had no analogues. Byzantium was a bridge between antiquity and Christianity, between East and West, between earth and heaven. It inherited the Greek language and philosophy, Roman law and statehood, and Christianity gave it a meaning that bound all this into a single body. The empire ceased to be a territory. It became an embodied idea, a theocracy where power was conceived as service to God, and culture as divine service. Even in the last centuries of its existence, when the empire dwindled to the size of a city-state, Byzantium remained great. Its spiritual presence did not depend on size, wealth, or army. It was expressed in the morning chanting of monks, in the smell of incense, in the gold of the iconostasis, in the text of a prayer written by the hand of a hermit. It was a civilization of inner light, quiet, deep, contemplative. It was this light that other peoples adopted. Rus, the Balkans, Eastern Europe, all of them became bearers of the Byzantine tradition. In Moscow, Kiev, and Ohrid, in Yashi and Thessaloniki, the same light burned, sometimes brighter, sometimes dimmer, but never completely disappearing. Even in the Western European Renaissance, rational and focused on man, an echo of Byzantine thought resonates, brought by Venetian ships with surviving manuscripts and teachers. Today, when we remember Byzantium, we are not just studying history. We hear the quiet voice of eternity, in the chanting, in the icon, in the architecture, where every line leads the gaze upwards, inwards, into silence. We touch a culture for which beauty was a reflection of truth, and truth, a path to salvation. Byzantium leaves us not with noise, but with silence. It does not need conquests. It remains in devotion to tradition, in the reading of the gospel, in harmonious texts and services. It was a kingdom unafraid of the end because it knew, beyond the last day, there is no emptiness but eternity. The light of Byzantium is not a flash. It is a fire that passes from lamp to lamp, from heart to heart. It does not blind, it guides. It does not require proof. It simply burns. And therefore, even centuries later, Byzantium remains. It lives in spirit, in prayer, in memory.